CBS News coverage of Election Night 68. Reporting from election headquarters, Walter Cronkite.
Good evening, everyone. We may be here for a very long night tonight. The last poll showed that this was going to be a very close election, and we'll be keeping tabs of it until we get the final returns in and know who the next president of the United States will be. H.G. Wells wrote that democracy's ceremonial, its feast, its great function is the election. Well, this was our ceremonial and our feast, the function today, the election. It appears that Americans turned out perhaps in record numbers. Possibly 75 million of us went to the polls around the nation. The weather was good in most places, and that perhaps helped the turnout. Perhaps the population wasn't quite as apathetic as some of us had thought that it was. Besides voting for the president, the population was voting for 34 senators, 21 governors, all of the House of Representatives, that's 435 of them. The legislatures in 43 states were up, and innumerable propositions, bond issues, and whether to have sale by the drink, and whether to vote for horse racing, that sort of thing, on the ballot in 44 other states. My colleagues and I will be here throughout the night, of course, to give you the returns on all of these votes. Mike Wallace will be reporting on the East, and Roger Mudd will be reporting on the South, Dan Rather on the Middle West, Joe Benty on the West, and Eric Severide will be giving us the benefit of his analysis from long years in Washington and watching these elections down through the years with all of us. Some of the polls have closed in Alabama, Kentucky, and Tennessee. Some other states, such as New Hampshire and Kansas, permit a certain number of their votes when all of their registered voters in a precinct have cast their ballots to reveal the vote at that early hour before all the polls have closed. In Kentucky, we have our first CBS News estimate of a winner. In the state of Kentucky, CBS News estimates that Richard Nixon will win that state, and when all the votes have been counted, he will have 43% of the vote, Humphrey 39% of the vote, and Wallace 18% of the vote. That was a state that Wallace had hoped to win if he were going to take border states and move his influence beyond the Deep South. We estimate now, on the basis of our sample precincts in the state of Kentucky, that state will be won by Richard Nixon. And now we can estimate that in Alabama, as expected, George Wallace will win that state. He will get no less than 62% and perhaps as high as 70% of the vote in his native state, as expected. That puts Wallace, in these early hours of what may be a very long night, into an early lead for the electoral vote. And, of course, that's the name of the game. Wallace has his 10 electoral votes now, according to our CBS News estimate, from Alabama. Nixon has his 9 electoral votes from Kentucky. And, Roger, I think you've got an interesting call from Florida for us.
Yes, sir, Walter. The CBS News estimates now show that Richard Nixon will carry the state of Florida. And you can see on the little map behind me that Florida and Kentucky are now forming up to box George Wallace into the Deep South. Our CBS News estimate shows that when the full votes are cast and counted in Florida, Nixon will carry the state of Florida 43% to Hubert Humphrey's 32%, George Wallace 25%.
And now CBS News estimates that when all of the votes are in from the state of North Carolina, Richard Nixon will win North Carolina with 43% of the vote. Humphrey will get 31% of the vote, and Wallace 26% of the vote. Here again, Wallace has not done as well as expected. Dan?
Walter, I believe that in the state of Indiana that we're very near calling that for Richard Nixon. My screen shows an asterisk beside Indiana and shows we're calling that in the winner column, the CBS News estimate.
I just got a confirmation of that, Dan. You're absolutely right. The CBS News estimates that Nixon will win Indiana, and that when all the vote is in, he'll have 50% of the vote there, Humphrey 38%, and Wallace 12%. CBS News estimates that in Connecticut, important state of Connecticut, Hubert Humphrey, when all the votes have been counted, will win with 50% of the vote. Richard Nixon will get 43% and Wallace 7% in Connecticut. Connecticut will be in Humphrey's column. In West Virginia,
Also, CBS News estimates that Humphrey will win there with 56% of the vote, Nixon 37%, and Wallace 7% of the vote. CBS News has estimated now that Nixon will win Kentucky, Florida, North Carolina, and Indiana for a total of 49 electoral votes. Humphrey will win Connecticut and West Virginia for a total of 15. Wallace will win Alabama for a total of 10. And now CBS News says that in Kansas, according to our sample precincts in, Nixon should win that heavily Republican state with 57% of the vote, Humphrey 35%, and Wallace 8% in Kansas. That adds to the Nixon total some 7 electoral votes for Kansas, which would bring him to a total of 56. CBS News estimate now on the presidential race in Georgia. CBS News estimates that when all the votes are counted in that southern state, George Wallace will pick up Georgia with 49% of the vote. Humphrey coming in second with 27%, and Nixon 24%. 12 electoral votes for George Wallace in Georgia to add to his 10 in Alabama. And a CBS News estimate in Vermont. CBS News figures show that when all of the count has been made, Nixon will win in Vermont by 57% of the vote, Humphrey 40%, and Wallace 3%. Nixon thus adds Vermont's 3 electoral votes to his total to bring his total to 59. Wallace has a total of 22 now, and Humphrey, with his wins in Connecticut and West Virginia, as we at CBS News see it, has 15. Oklahoma, yes. That call came just a moment ago. CBS News estimates that Nixon will win in Oklahoma by 47% of the vote, Humphrey 32%, and Wallace 21%. District of Columbia, Humphrey will win by 73% of the vote, and Nixon 27% of the vote.
In the state of Massachusetts, Humphrey declared the winner by CBS News estimate with 2% of the tabulated vote in. Humphrey with 30,000 and Richard Nixon with a mere 8,000 votes in Massachusetts, Wallace with 2,700 odd. Humphrey fashioned that victory in Massachusetts in a rather interesting way. He leads Nixon 3-1 in the area of Boston. He leads Nixon 2-1 in the suburbs of Massachusetts. He leads Nixon 4-1 in the black ghettos of Massachusetts, and also 4-1 in the backlash areas.
Roger, may I interrupt you, or am I interrupting you?
No, I'm all through.
Well, I was going to interrupt you to say that CBS News now estimates that Humphrey will win the state of Michigan with its nice sizable block of 21 electoral votes for his camp. Now, the Humphrey forces had anticipated on the basis of polling that they possibly would win Michigan. CBS News estimates now that they will, with 52% of the vote, Nixon 39%, and Wallace 9% of the vote. CBS News estimates now that in Mississippi, Wallace will win, as he was anticipated to do, with 64% of the vote, Humphrey 22%, and Nixon 14%. CBS News estimates the final returns in 2 states now. In Virginia, CBS News estimates that Nixon will win with 49% of the vote. Humphrey will get 29% of the vote, and Wallace 22% of the vote. In Virginia, it was anticipated that Nixon possibly would win there, but his margin was not thought to be quite that high. Virginia has 12 electoral votes. Louisiana, CBS News estimates that Wallace will win in Louisiana. That was anticipated also, that he will get in Louisiana 52% of the vote. Humphrey will get 27% of the vote, and Nixon 21% of the vote for Louisiana's 10 electoral votes. Arizona, CBS News estimates that Nixon will win that southwestern state with 52% of the vote. Humphrey will get 41% and Wallace 7%. There are 5 electoral votes in Arizona, and that would bring Nixon's total in the states where CBS News estimates he will win to 84. Humphrey has 5 states with a total of 53. Humphrey states are Connecticut, West Virginia, District of Columbia, Massachusetts, and Michigan.
With 11% of the vote in. Now, in the Minnesota presidential race, CBS News estimates that Humphrey wins in Minnesota. Now, that is the second state in the Midwest in which CBS News estimates Humphrey has won, Michigan with 21 electoral votes being the other. And in Minnesota, CBS News estimates that Humphrey carries his home state with 56% to Nixon's 38%, George Wallace with 5%. Walter, it's still a heart-stopper in Ohio and Illinois, and that's the big story in the Midwest.
In the state of North Dakota, Richard Nixon will win when all the votes have been counted there, with 57% of the vote, Humphrey 38%, and Wallace 5% of the vote. CBS News estimates that in Rhode Island, Humphrey will win there with 65% of the vote, Nixon 31%, and Wallace 4% of the vote.
Joe, let me interrupt you for a moment. A most important call. CBS News estimates on the basis of our sample returns in from our sample precincts so far in New York State that Hubert Humphrey will carry New York State. Humphrey, 52% of the vote, Nixon, 43% of the vote, and Wallace, 5% of the vote, is what our CBS News estimate shows for New York and the nation's biggest block of electoral votes. Dan, have you got some news from the Middle West for us?
Yes, Walter. According to CBS News estimate here, we're very close to indicating that we believe that Richard Nixon has carried Wisconsin, although our tentative board, CBS News, yes, estimates Richard Nixon the winner in Wisconsin by approximately the percentages you see there.
CBS News estimates that in Colorado, Richard Nixon, the Republican candidate for President of the United States, will win Colorado with a bare 50% of the vote, Humphrey 42% of the vote there, and Wallace 8% of the vote in Colorado.
And in Iowa, on the presidential race, CBS News now estimates that when all the votes are counted there, Richard Nixon will indeed win Iowa with 60% of the vote, Humphrey 35% of the vote, and Wallace 5% of the vote in Iowa. And now, from Maine, a presidential estimate by CBS that Hubert Humphrey will carry Maine with 57% of the vote. And Nixon will get 42% of the vote we estimate in Maine, that Wallace will get 1% of the vote there. It had been anticipated that Humphrey might well carry Maine. The consensus of the polls was he might carry it with around 50% of the vote. He did better than that. New Hampshire, we've got a presidential decision on a basis of our CBS News estimate that when all the votes are counted there, Richard Nixon will win New Hampshire with 56% of the vote, Humphrey 42, Wallace 2. And in Nebraska, CBS News estimates that in Nebraska, Nixon will win that state as anticipated with 68% of the vote, Humphrey 26, and Wallace 6. Adding Nebraska's vote now to Nixon's total, that's 5 more electoral votes for 124. CBS News estimate of the final returns in South Dakota is that Nixon will win South Dakota's 4 electoral votes with 55% of the vote there, Humphrey 41%, and Wallace 4%. Pennsylvania, here is the big one. CBS News estimates that in Pennsylvania, Hubert Humphrey will win that state with 49% of the vote. Richard Nixon will get 43% of the vote, and Wallace will get 8% of the vote. 29 big electoral votes for Hubert Humphrey, according to our CBS News estimate. Nixon will win Wyoming as anticipated with 58% of the vote, Humphrey 33, and Wallace 9. That is our anticipation. That will give Nixon 131 electoral votes to Humphrey's 143. And it is indeed a close race tonight. CBS News estimates that in the Montana presidential race, Richard Nixon will win Montana, as had been anticipated, 51%, Humphrey 41%, and Wallace a 8%, which is quite a bit lower than it had been anticipated Wallace might get in Montana.
Well, Walter, we just had another call, presidential call in Oregon. Richard Nixon has taken the state of Oregon. He should have 53% of the vote, 52%. Hubert Humphrey, 43%. Wallace, 5%. Oregon's 6 electoral votes, therefore, to Richard Nixon now gives him 24 out of the 95 in the far west, and 5 states in his column. Humphrey not leading in any yet.
South Carolina now, according to our CBS News estimate, is going to Richard Nixon and not to George Wallace, as some had anticipated it might. South Carolina's votes are now in the Nixon column. That's 8 more electoral votes for a total of 149 electoral votes. We have a CBS News estimate in Idaho that Nixon will carry Idaho as expected with its 4 electoral votes, and that makes his total now 153 electoral votes to Humphrey's 143. 270 electoral votes are needed, as you know. And now Utah, according to CBS News estimate, can be put in the Nixon column as well, as had been anticipated. That is 54 more electoral votes for Richard Nixon, 4 more electoral votes for Richard Nixon. He wins the state, according to CBS News, with 54% of the vote, and Humphrey 35%, Wallace an 11%, a rather strong showing for him in the Mormon state of Utah. CBS News estimate in the state of New Mexico, Richard Nixon will win New Mexico as anticipated. Our CBS News estimate tells us Nixon should win with 54% of the vote, Humphrey 39%, and Wallace 7% in New Mexico. That will give Richard Nixon 161 electoral votes, Hubert Humphrey 143. The CBS News estimate in Nevada now gives Nevada to Richard Nixon, as was expected there, with 46% of the vote, Humphrey 42. Humphrey ran a closer race than anticipated in Nevada. Wallace got 12% of the vote there. And with those 3 electoral votes now, Richard Nixon has 164 electoral votes, Humphrey 143.